The morning had begun like any other on the Hales' land. A slow, golden sunrise spilled over the flat horizon, warming the tops of the tall cornstalks and glinting off the dewdrops that clung to the fence posts. Jerome Hale had been awake before the first rooster crowed, his boots laced tight, his worn hat pulled low over his brow. The farmhouse was quiet, empty but for the groaning of the old boards beneath his feet and the occasional creak of settling timbers. He hadn't bothered turning on the radio yet. Mornings were for listening to the land. He moved through the routine with the calm certainty of a man who had done the same work for decades. He fed the chickens, checked the irrigation system, and walked the perimeter of the southern field, pausing every so often to feel the soil between his fingers. Jerome had always believed a man's relationship with his land wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be honored. This farm had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now it was his. 40 years he'd worked this soil, and not a day had gone by that he didn't give thanks for it. But there were signs. Subtle, quiet, unsettling. The hens hadn't laid properly in days. The cattle had grown restless, milling near the northern fence line in the dead of night, snorting like something was stirring under their hooves. Jerome tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Animals had moods too, but the unease settled deep in his chest like a pebble under the tongue. He'd chalked it up to the dry spell and the unusually warm nights, but something didn't sit right. By early evening, the wind shifted. It blew heavy and warm from the east, carrying with it a strange tang in the air, part mineral, part chemical, and entirely unfamiliar. Jerome stood on the porch as the sun dipped behind the low hills and watched the tall grass sway in strange, uneven patterns. He could feel something pressing just beneath the calm, as though the earth was holding its breath. That night, long after he'd gone to bed, the stillness shattered. At first, it was subtle, a low vibration, like a distant freight train passing through far-off hills. Jerome stirred in bed, half awake, unsure if the sound was real or something from a dream. But then the bed frame jolted violently, and the glass on his nightstand tipped and shattered on the hardwood floor. The walls groaned, the old nails squealing as the wood swayed under unseen pressure. Jerome shot upright, heart pounding in his chest. He had grown up under tornado warnings, seen trees twisted into ropes by wind. But this was something else. The house itself seemed to shift, shuddering like a living thing under duress. Books toppled from the shelves, picture frames fell, and from the kitchen came the unmistakable crash of dishes breaking. He threw on a shirt, grabbed his flashlight, and rushed out the front door as the ground rolled beneath his feet. Outside, the night was electric with tension. The stars above flickered as if the sky itself was uneasy. Jerome stumbled into the yard, catching himself on the fence post. Behind him, the house creaked ominously, the porch listing to one side. Then, just as quickly as it began, the shaking stopped. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the ragged breaths escaping his lungs. He turned slowly, shining his light across the fields. Cracks had split the yard, jagged and deep. His barn leaned awkwardly, and the windmill beside it no longer turned. He stood in the silence for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But it didn't. Morning arrived gray and overcast, casting long, thin shadows across the torn-up earth. Jerome made his way slowly across the southern field, stepping carefully over loose soil and broken fence posts. The land had ruptured in the night. He could see it from 100 yards away. A massive gash had opened near the old well, a deep, jagged wound in the earth that stretched down into complete darkness. It wasn't just a crack. It was a chasm. As he approached, the smell hit him. Wet clay and something else, sharp and acrid. It reminded him of the time lightning had struck an old propane tank 2 farms over. A chemical burn, low and metallic in the nose. He crouched near the edge and shined his flashlight downward. At first, it looked like rock and root, but then the beam caught something. Metallic glints, a smooth curve in the soil, as though something artificial had been unearthed. He leaned closer, heart racing, and realized that what he was looking at wasn't a natural formation at all. It was a tunnel, wide, smooth, curved unnaturally, leading into blackness. He took a step back, breath caught in his throat. The tremor, the animals, the smell, it all fit now in a way he couldn't accept. Something was buried under his land, something man-made, and it hadn't been there before. Jerome spent the rest of the day trying to tell himself he was overreacting. Maybe it was an old drainage line, maybe something left behind by surveyors, but no one had ever said anything about tunnels. And besides, the shape, it was too perfect, too deliberate. That night, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the house made him flinch. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than usual. By midnight, he found himself back outside, standing by the edge of the sinkhole. The beam from his flashlight disappeared into the depths, swallowed whole by the black. The earth, it seemed, was trying to tell him something, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He took one last breath of cool night air, straightened his shoulders, and turned back toward the house. Tomorrow, he would call Henry. If anyone could help make sense of this, it was him. They'd been through hard times together, and Jerome trusted the man more than anyone left in this part of the county. As he reached the steps, he turned for one last look at the gash in the field. Something about it made his skin crawl. The silence surrounding it was too complete, the air too still, the shadows inside the chasm too dark. Whatever had opened beneath his feet, it wasn't finished. And deep in his bones, Jerome knew that whatever secrets the land had hidden for so long were finally clawing their way back into the light. The morning came gray and sluggish, dragging itself across the horizon like a tired animal. Jerome stood at the edge of the sinkhole, arms crossed over his chest, the brim of his hat low against the wind. The night had brought no clarity, only more questions. He'd lain awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above his bed, running through possibilities, weighing risk against instinct. But by sunrise, there was only one conclusion that made sense. He couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. He reached for his phone and dialed the only number that mattered in situations like this. Henry Morris answered on the second ring, voice already gruff with caffeine and suspicion. Jerome kept it simple. Told him there had been a sinkhole on the south field, that it looked bad and that he needed help. He didn't elaborate. Henry didn't ask questions. 30 minutes later, the familiar rumble of Henry's old Dodge truck pulled into the gravel drive. Henry stepped out dressed in work boots and a battered utility jacket, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. His face, weathered like the land itself, tightened into a frown as soon as he saw the hole. Without a word, he followed Jerome across the field, both of them moving quietly through the bent grass and loose soil until they stood at the rim. "Hell of a hole," Henry muttered, kneeling down to examine the edge. "Looks deep." Jerome nodded. "There's more to it. I saw something down there. Metal. Shapes that didn't make sense." Henry shot him a look. "You think it's a well?" "No. Too wide, too smooth. I think someone dug it." Henry stared into the darkness for a long moment. Then he unzipped his bag and pulled out a pair of high-powered flashlights and a coil of climbing rope. Then, I guess we're going to find out. They worked in silence, securing the rope to the axle of Henry's truck and testing its weight. Jerome went first, descending slowly, the flashlight clutched tightly in his free hand. The dirt walls around him were warm to the touch, strangely so, and layered with bands of red and gray that shimmered under the light. The air grew heavier with each foot of descent, thick with a strange mineral scent that stung the back of his throat. By the time his boots touched the floor of the hole, sweat clung to his back and his shirt was damp beneath his coat. He swung the light in a slow arc and froze. The tunnel wasn't just there. It was intentional. A wide, hollow passage carved into the earth, extending in both directions, the walls unnaturally smooth and laced with what looked like veins of black rock, pulsing faintly in the light. Henry joined him a minute later, grunting as he landed beside Jerome. "Well," he said, glancing around, "ain't no natural formation, that's for sure." They walked deeper, the tunnel swallowing the sound of their footsteps. The walls began to change, the black veins growing more prominent, intersecting in geometric patterns. Jerome ran his fingers across the lines. They weren't random. They felt etched, cut into the soil with purpose. Farther in, debris littered the edges, tangled roots, broken boards, rusted bolts, and a half-buried length of pipe crusted with dirt and age. Then came the smell. It hit them like a wave, sulfuric, sour, and thick enough to choke on. Jerome gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve. Henry spat on the ground and swore. "Something's leaking," he said. "Could be gas, could be worse." They pressed on, careful to avoid the slick puddles that began to appear underfoot. The water was shallow, but coated in a yellowish film that shimmered like oil. The deeper they went, the more the air fought against them, hotter, denser, and laced with fumes that made Jerome's eyes burn. They reached a bend in the tunnel where the ceiling had partially collapsed. Water dripped steadily from above, forming stagnant pools around their boots. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the overhead soil and spotted the same strange red rings embedded in the dirt, like scars in the earth. Something had been pressing from the inside, forcing its way outward. Henry motioned for them to stop. "You hear that?" he whispered. Jerome listened. At first, nothing. Then, faint, distant, came a low mechanical hum, barely audible but rhythmic. It pulsed beneath their feet, a steady beat that didn't belong in a place like this. His stomach turned. "This is active," Henry said. "Someone's down here, or something still is." They didn't say more. Words felt dangerous in that place. They turned around slowly, their eyes scanning every shadow, every glint of metal in the soil. Jerome noticed something just off the main path, half buried in the mud, a beam of blackened wood. He knelt, brushing dirt away until letters emerged, scorched into the grain. MLB.co. The rest had been eaten away by time or fire. But it was enough. Jerome stood and stared into the dark. "Someone built this," he said quietly, "and they didn't want anyone to know." They made their way back carefully, marking their path with small scratches in the wall. The air felt even heavier on the return, as if the tunnel was reluctant to let them go. When they reached the rope, they climbed out in silence, their clothes and faces streaked with grime. The sulfur clung to them like an invisible warning. They sat on the tailgate of Henry's truck, sharing a bottle of water and watching the wind stir the grass around the hole. "What do you think they were doing?" Henry asked finally. Jerome shook his head. "Something big, maybe illegal, maybe dangerous." "You think it's oil?" "I don't know, but it ain't farming, and it sure as hell ain't natural." They watched the field for a long time, neither willing to say what they both knew. Something had changed. The land wasn't quiet anymore. It had secrets, old ones, buried deep. Before leaving, Jerome walked back to the hole. He stared down into it, flashlight off. There was movement inside, subtle and slow, like the earth breathing. He stepped back and returned to the truck. They drove away with the windows down, trying to rid themselves of the smell. But even as the farm shrank in the rearview mirror, Jerome couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't climbed out alone. Something was still with them, something that had waited a long time to be found. The days that followed were marked by a quiet intensity. Jerome moved through them as though sleepwalking, the routines of the farm suddenly hollow and mechanical. He fed the animals, repaired a loose fence post near the north lot, even cut and stacked firewood in the shed. But his mind was elsewhere, always circling back to the tunnel, to the scorched wood with the strange markings, and to the impossible hum that had echoed beneath the earth. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black veins in the walls, the oil-streaked puddles, the yellow film that coated the ground like disease. He tried to explain it away. Maybe it was some long-abandoned mining shaft or an experimental irrigation system, but the facts resisted. That place was not a relic. It was active, alive in its own terrible way. Henry had grown quieter since their descent. He didn't return to the farm after that day, and when Jerome called him 2 mornings later, his voice was clipped, almost guarded. "Still thinking about it," was all he'd say. "Let me know if you find anything." Then he hung up. Jerome didn't press. He knew Henry well enough to understand the man wasn't scared. He was angry. Angry at being lied to by the land he thought he knew. Angry that something so large had been hidden right beneath their feet. Jerome knew he needed more. He needed answers. Real ones. Not guesses, not theories. He wanted to know what MLB stood for, who had dug those tunnels, and what had been taken from his soil without permission. But more than that, he wanted to understand how it had been hidden from him. His grandfather had walked these fields. His father had died on them. How could something so vast have escaped generations of eyes and ears? He began with the county records office, a squat brick building with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights on the edge of town. The clerk, a tired woman with half-moon glasses and a cardigan far too thick for the weather, led him to a back room lined with file cabinets. "Start with land surveys," she said, gesturing vaguely to a wall of yellowing folders. "If it's old, it's in there." Then she returned to her desk and didn't look up again. Jerome spent hours combing through maps and deeds, most of them handwritten or copied so many times they were nearly illegible. He traced the ownership of his land back through time. His father, then his grandfather, and before that, a white landowner named Vernon Blake, who had subdivided the original acreage in the 1930s. Nothing in the official deeds mentioned underground rights. No reference to mineral leases, no notations about easements or exploratory drilling. But then, tucked between 2 fragile sheets of carbon paper, he found a survey from 1958. The map was crudely drawn, but Jerome recognized the shape of his southern field immediately. A black rectangle had been marked in ink near the base of the hill, labeled simply as Sector C. Below it, in faded type, was a note: "Approved for exploratory shaft. Permit filed with Tri-State Extraction." His breath caught. Tri-State. The letters matched. Not perfectly, but close enough. MLB could have been a later name. A rebranding. He made a copy of the document and left the office with shaking hands. Back at home, he sat on the porch with the map spread across his lap and stared out at the hills. The grass swayed gently in the wind, and from this distance the land looked untouched, pure. But now he knew better. There had been drills in his soil before he was born, and no one had told his family. The betrayal settled deep in his gut. The next morning, he drove 20 miles north to the County Historical Society where dusty files and long-dead headlines lived in uneasy harmony. There, he met Arthur Langford, a retired schoolteacher turned local historian. Langford was thin, nearly skeletal, with skin like parchment and sharp blue eyes that held too much memory. When Jerome showed him the map and the name Tri-State, something flickered in the old man's gaze. "That name hasn't come up in a long time," Langford said softly, turning the map in his bony fingers. "They were drilling here before the interstate came through, quietly. No fanfare. Most folks didn't even know." "My family didn't," Jerome said. Langford nodded. "I'm not surprised. They didn't need to tell anyone. Back then, most of the black farmers didn't hold mineral rights to their land. Those were separate contracts, legalese buried in deeds signed under pressure, or not signed at all. They'd claim it was part of the public trust, or state reserves, or federal interest. You could own the soil, but not what was under it." Jerome felt his jaw clench. "So they just came and took it." "They always do," Langford said, not unkindly. The old man led him to a filing cabinet in the back and pulled out a folder marked TSE Corp. Inside were photocopies of newspaper clippings, corporate brochures, even a faded photograph of a drill site, mud-slicked ground, 2 white men in coveralls beside a vertical rig. In the background was a small house. Jerome leaned closer. It looked like his grandfather's cabin, long since demolished. The date on the photo read 1964. "They operated under different names," Langford explained. "Tri-State, Midland Extraction, later something called Kendrick's Energy. Always the same men, though. They'd open a shaft, pull what they could, then vanish before anyone noticed." "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Jerome asked. Langford offered a thin smile. "Because no one who matters lost anything." Jerome left with copies of everything. As he drove home, anger settled in his chest like a hot stone. They had used his land, exploited his family's ignorance, turned the earth into a hidden factory, leaving behind only poisoned puddles and rotten wood. And now, decades later, they were still at it, still digging, still taking. That night, unable to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table with all the papers spread before him. The photo, the survey, the map, the name Kendrick's Energy kept surfacing in the margins of reports, always listed as a consulting firm or a logistics partner, never as the company responsible. It was a shell, a veil, and AMLB.co. Could that be Midland Land Boring? The letters fit, the location fit, the tunnel fit. He scribbled notes until dawn. The next day, he called Henry again. This time, the man answered with more weight in his voice. Jerome told him what he'd found, about Tri-State, the old survey, the photo, the shift in names. There was silence on the line for a long time. "They've been here the whole damn time," Henry said at last, "and we never knew." "They counted on that," Jerome replied. They agreed to meet the next morning. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was theft, violation, and if no one else was going to uncover the truth, they would do it themselves. Jerome stood at the edge of the sinkhole that evening, the light fading around him. He stared into the dark, jaw set, fists clenched at his sides. The land beneath him wasn't just soil and root. It was a crime scene, and ghosts, Old, silent, buried ghosts were beginning to stir. By the time morning came, Jerome was already dressed and waiting on the porch, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that promised heat later in the day, but offered little now beyond silence and stillness. The air hung heavy, and the fields that once sang with life now seemed hushed, as though the earth itself was waiting, listening. Henry's truck pulled into the gravel drive right on time, his familiar silhouette behind the wheel casting a long shadow through the dust. As he stepped out, he gave Jerome a single nod, not a greeting, but a confirmation. They were both beyond words now. What they were about to do wasn't some idle curiosity or harmless exploration. This was about reclaiming something. Not just answers, but truth. And maybe justice. Jerome climbed into the passenger seat without a word, and Henry pulled back onto the road. They drove south toward the state line, passing through fields, fences, and distant homes. Neither spoke for the first 20 minutes. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was focused. A weight shared evenly across the seat. Their destination was a small environmental research station nestled between the highway and a dying creek bed, a place where Henry's niece, Kayla Springer, worked as a field ecologist. She was sharp, determined, and had once taken on a major agriculture company over pesticide runoff and won. If anyone could help them, it was her. Kayla met them in the parking lot, clipboard in one hand, dark hair pulled into a practical bun, and a look in her eyes that said she wasn't interested in pleasantries. Jerome laid everything out quickly. The tunnel, the collapse, the smell of sulfur, the burned beam with the initials, and the documents he'd uncovered in the archives. As he spoke, Kayla's expression shifted from guarded to focused. "So, you think there's active industrial activity beneath your land, undocumented and ongoing?" she asked. Jerome nodded. "I don't just think it, I've seen it." "And you're saying the same company that was drilling illegally in the 60s might be doing it again under a different name?" "That's what it looks like," Henry said, "and it's big, real big." Kayla stared at them both for a moment, then gestured toward her work shed. "I've got sensors, samplers, infrared cameras, and enough protective gear to survive a chemical spill. Let's load up." An hour later, they stood once more at the edge of the sinkhole. The sun was directly overhead now, casting shadows into the depths. Kayla strapped on a mask and headlamp, clipped a device to her belt that read air quality, and descended first, her movements efficient and practiced. Jerome followed, then Henry, all three of them swallowed by the dark, earthy maw. Inside the tunnel, the air was worse than before. The heat clung to their skin like oil, and the sulfur smell was sharper, more insistent. Kayla's device beeped softly every few seconds, recording the fluctuations in gas concentration and temperature. The walls of the tunnel pulsed faintly in the flashlight beams, the black veins glistening with sweat-like moisture. As they moved deeper, Kayla paused frequently to collect soil samples, scrape residue from the walls, and snap photographs. The geometric lines embedded in the tunnel walls were clearer now, the symmetry too precise to be anything but engineered. They passed the place where Jerome had found the charred beam and the partial company name. Kayla crouched beside it, her gloved fingers brushing the markings, and took several high-resolution close-ups. "There's more than just evidence here," she said softly. "There's intent." Further in, the tunnel branched. They took the right fork, which sloped downward at a shallow incline. The floor grew slick, the puddles deeper and lined with an oily film that shimmered in the light. Kayla knelt beside one, uncapped a vial, and filled it. The smell that rose from the liquid was unmistakable. Petroleum, raw and pungent. Crude oil, she confirmed. Unrefined. Someone's been drilling. Recently. They pressed on. The tunnel widened again, and the temperature rose. Jerome could feel sweat trickling down his back, soaking into his shirt. The walls here were reinforced with rusted metal ribs, and old cables hung from the ceiling like vines in a forgotten cave. At the far end, tucked against the left wall, was a metal box. Half buried, rusted, its lid askew. Inside were binders sealed in plastic, brittle papers, and several blueprints. Kayla lifted one out carefully and unfolded it across the tunnel wall. The lines were faint but visible, a schematic of the tunnel network beneath Jerome's property. Labeled shafts, pressure valves, collection nodes, terms that belonged in an oil field, not a family farm. One of the pages bore the Kendricks Energy logo in the corner, dated just 2 years prior. Jerome felt his knees weaken. They're still using it. And they've expanded it, Kayla added. Look at this. This isn't just under your land. It goes beneath your neighbors. This whole grid is a web. You're right in the center. Henry cursed under his breath. Kayla took photos of every page, then packed them carefully in her satchel. The beeping from her air monitor grew faster. We need to keep moving. The gas levels are spiking. They followed the tunnel farther, their path lit only by headlamps and the occasional flicker of their flashlights bouncing off wet stone and metal. Ahead, the sound changed. A low hiss, steady and mechanical. They approached cautiously, and as they rounded the next bend, they saw it. A rusted pipe ran along the base of the wall, its seams cracked, leaking thick black oil that pooled in a trough dug into the earth. A pump sat beside it, old but still running, its vibrations barely audible over the hum. Kayla approached and took a video, noting the serial numbers stamped into the housing. This is industrial grade, she said, and it's powered, which means someone is maintaining it. Jerome stared at the pipe, watching the oil ooze and collect. This is theft, he whispered. They've been stealing from us for decades. They backtracked carefully, avoiding the unstable spots, retracing their steps by the scratches Jerome had made on the wall. At the beam, Kayla paused again, this time pulling a small ultraviolet flashlight from her bag. She scanned the area, and the beam glowed faintly under the light. Chemicals, residues, signs of heat exposure. She stood, her expression grim. They tried to destroy evidence, but they missed a lot. When they emerged into the daylight, blinking and coated in dirt and sweat, the weight of what they discovered clung to them like a second skin. Jerome sat on the grass beside the hole, staring into nothing. His farm, his family's land, had been violated. And not just once, but continuously, methodically, like a parasite feeding in the dark. We have to expose this, he said quietly. We can't let them keep doing it. Kayla nodded. We have what we need to start. Samples, photos, documents. It's a start. Henry stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. They're not going to go down easy. Then we don't go down either, Jerome said. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass in the field. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the soil. Jerome looked out over the land, his land, and felt something shift inside him. No longer just a farmer, no longer just a caretaker. Now he was something else, a witness, a defender. Beneath the skin of the earth, the truth had stirred, and now it was ready to rise. The night was long and restless. Jerome lay in bed with the windows open, the soft chirping of crickets mixing with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, but none of it calmed the storm in his mind. The discoveries of the day clung to him like a second skin. The smell of oil, the eerie hum of machinery, the blueprints in Kayla's bag now hidden under his kitchen floorboards. Even after a hot shower, the sulfur scent lingered faintly on his hands. He stared at the ceiling until the pale light of dawn began to creep across the walls, and even then, sleep did not come. Outside, the world seemed still. The fields were quiet, the animals subdued, as if the land itself had sensed the intrusion and recoiled. Jerome stepped outside into the heavy morning air. The sky was the color of iron, low-hanging clouds promising another sweltering day. He walked to the edge of the sinkhole, now partially cordoned off with warning tape Kayla had insisted on placing, and stood there in silence. The tunnel was still there, gaping like an old wound. Nothing stirred inside, but Jerome no longer trusted the quiet. Beneath the surface, he could feel it. Activity, motion, secrets. He spent the rest of the morning making copies of the documents they had found, carefully labeling each page, organizing the soil and liquid samples Kayla had left with him in sealed bags. She was planning to deliver the originals to a contact at the state environmental office, someone she claimed was trustworthy. But she had warned him. Without public pressure, without a broader spotlight, the system would likely stall or bury it. That was how these companies survived. Delay, confuse, obscure. Jerome wasn't ready to let that happen. By late afternoon, as he was feeding the cattle near the eastern fence line, he felt it, first as a vibration underfoot, then as a deep unnatural rumble that rose from the earth like thunder in the bones. The cows grew agitated, turning in place, lowing anxiously. One of them backed into the fence, snapping a wooden post clean in half. Jerome dropped the feed bucket and turned toward the southern field. The sound intensified, louder now, a roaring pulse that grew and grew until it became a sudden explosion, sharp, violent, and close. The ground shook beneath him. He staggered, catching himself against the fence, eyes wide as a column of black smoke shot into the sky from beyond the tree line at the far end of the field. A second later came the wind, a hot, rushing wave that carried with it dust, debris, and a foul stench that coated his tongue and burned his throat. Jerome ran. He reached the hill just as a second smaller blast shook the earth again, this one muffled but no less devastating. The trees near the edge of the field were bent at odd angles, their roots torn from the soil, the grass flattened in a perfect arc around a new crater. The earth had collapsed inward, swallowing part of the ridge, and in the center of the blast zone was a twisted heap of metal piping and machinery still steaming. He stood there, staring, until a piece of red plastic fluttered past his feet. He caught it without thinking. It was thin, like packaging material, but printed across its surface in bold black letters were 3 unmistakable characters: TNT. It hadn't been a natural collapse. It had been sabotage. Jerome's hands curled into fists. His chest rose and fell with short, shallow breaths. They had detonated part of the tunnel, destroyed evidence, and nearly taken out his land along with it. The rage that filled him then was quiet, cold, and absolute. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. Whoever these people were, they were dangerous, and they were desperate. He returned to the house and locked the doors. Then he picked up the phone and called Henry. By nightfall, they were seated at Henry's kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey between them, the red TNT scrap laid out flat under a lamp. Kayla had joined them as well, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the images from their last tunnel excursion. She looked up only when Jerome slid the plastic toward her. "They blew part of it," he said. She studied the material, turned it over, sniffed it. This is commercial grade, controlled demolition. Someone knew exactly where to place it. They're covering tracks, Henry said, or trying to scare us off. They won't, Jerome added. They discussed options late into the night. Going to the police with only a name and some blueprints would accomplish nothing. The sheriff was known to be friendly with energy interests, and even if he wasn't, they lacked proof that connected the operation directly to Kendricks or MLB. They needed more. Something undeniable. A photograph, a person, a name. Kayla suggested going public. The press, a sympathetic journalist. But even that could backfire. If the company suspected exposure was imminent, they might destroy the rest of the tunnel system or threaten others. What they needed first was documentation. Hard, verifiable evidence of an ongoing operation. Images of the machines in use, samples being extracted, and people actively involved. They planned to return the next day at dawn. Back at home, Jerome hardly slept. The explosion had disturbed more than just the land. His trust in the world had shifted. All his life he had believed in the quiet safety of rural existence. The idea that if you worked hard and kept to yourself, the land would reward you with peace. But now he saw how easily peace could be stripped away, how those with power could hollow the ground beneath a man without so much as knocking on his door. He woke before sunrise, dressed in silence, and packed his bag with gloves, extra batteries, the waterproof camera Kayla had given him, and a crowbar for good measure. When Henry and Kayla arrived, they didn't speak. There was no need. The mission had changed. They reached the tunnel before the sun had fully risen. The air was thick and still, the only sounds their footsteps in the grass and the occasional rustle of leaves. The opening to the tunnel yawned before them, darker than they remembered. Jerome led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Inside, the tunnel was unchanged at first. The smell, the heat, the oppressive silence. But deeper in, near where they had previously turned back, new signs emerged. Fresh footprints in the damp soil. Recent scuff marks along the wall where equipment had been dragged. The cable lines, once limp and forgotten, now taut and humming faintly with power. They reached a narrow passage Kayla hadn't noticed before, half concealed behind a stack of broken crates. It led downward, steep and slick, into a lower chamber. As they descended, a soft, rhythmic sound became audible. Machinery, pumps, and voices. They reached a wide cavern lit by industrial lights bolted into the ceiling. In the center stood a massive, rusted machine, churning with slow, deliberate motion. Thick pipes fed into it from both sides, pumping crude oil into waiting vats. Around it moved 3 men in blue jumpsuits, their faces hidden by masks, their bodies focused on their work. Jerome froze. The insignia on their uniforms was unmistakable. MLB. He raised the camera and began to record. Slowly, methodically, taking in every detail, the faces, the equipment, the tanks, the leaking pipes. Kayla followed suit, snapping photos from every angle. Henry stood near the entrance, keeping watch. They had what they came for. But then a radio crackled from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, followed by hurried footsteps. Jerome motioned for retreat. They backed out quickly, avoiding loose gravel, retracing their steps to the main corridor. Only when the light of the entrance came into view did they allow themselves to breathe. Outside, they didn't speak. The wind moved through the trees above them like an exhale. The evidence was real, weighty in their bags, proof they had it now. Later that night, Jerome sent copies of the footage to 3 places. Kayla's contact at the Environmental Bureau, a journalist she trusted in the city, and a secure cloud account she had set up just in case. As he sealed the samples and labeled the photos, he felt a shift within himself. Not just anger now, but purpose. They had struck a second blow, but it would be their last. The morning came cloaked in silence, but the kind of silence that carried weight. It was not the peace of dawn or the hush of nature still waking. It was the silence before movement, before confrontation, before truth collided with consequences. Jerome stood at the edge of the field, the same spot where days earlier a blast had torn the earth open and scattered fragments of stolen industry across his family's land. The crater remained, though partially cordoned off now by a makeshift barrier of rope and warning signs. Birds no longer landed nearby. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass over it. He had spent the night turning over the images they had captured, the glowing footage of oil flowing through rusted pumps, the insignias on the uniforms, the serial numbers etched into machinery, the precise geometry of an illegal operation unfolding beneath his soil. It was all real now, undeniable and present. No longer myth, no longer suspicion. He had video, samples, documents, and now names. The footage had been shared with trusted hands, but trust was fragile and time was short. If they waited too long, the company would vanish again like smoke, just as it had in generations past. The plan was clear. One more trip into the tunnels, deeper than before, to gather every last shred of evidence. The core of the operation had to be exposed, not just the machinery, but the people, the control systems, the records that proved intentional exploitation and decades of cover-up. Jerome wasn't just acting for himself now. He was acting for his father, who had never known what was stolen from beneath him. For his grandfather, who had tilled this land while men in hard hats tapped what lay below. For his neighbors, who might also be standing above silent thefts and never know it. Henry arrived first, driving up with his usual dust-covered dodge, his jaw tight and eyes shadowed with something deeper than fatigue. Kayla followed not long after, this time with 2 sets of spare batteries, 3 sealed sample kits, and a reinforced waterproof camera. Her face was calm, but Jerome could see it. The tension behind her eyes, the stiffness in her jaw. She understood what this meant. She had known since the moment she saw the first glistening oil stain on the soil. They were walking back into danger, and this time they couldn't afford to retreat early. They made their descent just after 8, once the sun had risen far enough to cast full light across the rim of the crater. The tunnel welcomed them with its usual cocktail of heat, fumes, and silence, but now it felt different, like a corridor waiting to collapse. The walls were damp, streaked with new rivulets of oil and condensation. Jerome moved with purpose, following the familiar path to the lower chambers, past the old beam, past the fork where they had previously turned right. Today they turned left. This new passage sloped downward more steeply than the others. The floor was slick with black residue, the air thick and unkind. A faint humming greeted them early, mechanical and rhythmic, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This was the center. Not the edge, not the outer layer of an operation, but its beating core. The tunnel opened into a cavernous space, wide enough to hold a barn and tall enough for a 2-story scaffold to stretch toward the ceiling. Light poured from the mounted fixtures screwed into support beams, casting harsh white across metal grates, fuel tanks, and a central command panel surrounded by glass screens. There were 3 people inside, 2 in full jumpsuits, their backs turned, and 1 seated at the console. Jerome raised his hand slowly and motioned for silence. Kayla crept forward, camera rolling, her breathing shallow behind her mask. Henry remained by the entrance, eyes scanning the tunnel behind them. Jerome stepped closer, heart pounding in rhythm with the distant hum of the machinery. He focused on the console, on the illuminated company logo pulsing on the screen. Kendrick's Energy. There it was, full and undeniable. Not a shell name or initials, not a guess. The company responsible. The man at the console spoke into a headset, his voice low and hurried. Pressure on shaft 12 rising faster than expected. Relay backup valve now. We can't afford another surface breach this week. Jerome's chest tightened. Another breach. This wasn't an isolated accident. It was routine. A calculated risk in a decades-long theft. He raised the camera and zoomed in on the screen as Kayla took stills of the scaffolding and machinery. The entire room was a command center, and from the schematic displayed across the wall-mounted monitor, it was clear that the tunnel system stretched for miles. Beneath farms, beneath creeks, maybe even beneath the town. Kayla moved to the far wall where a set of cabinets lined the steel siding. She pulled one open slowly, revealing folders stacked neatly inside. Each was labeled with field numbers, dates, and production yields. She opened the top file and held it out for Jerome to see. It was a report. 15 years of records, tracking extraction rates, chemical usage, and inspection cycles. His name wasn't on it, but the coordinates at the top matched his southern field. He took pictures of every page, his hands shaken now not with fear, but fury. These weren't accidents. These weren't oversights. This was a system. A quiet, calculated theft stretching back decades, hidden under the very feet of those who were told they owned the land. Then came the sound. A clatter near the far wall, metal on concrete. One of the workers turned, eyes locking with Jerome's. For a moment, everything froze. Then the man shouted, "Hey!" Jerome turned and ran. Kayla stuffed the files into her pack and followed. Henry already pulling back into the main tunnel, motioning frantically. Footsteps pounded behind them and voices echoed off the walls. They moved fast, ducking through the narrower passageways, past the pump room, past the cracked valve near the oil trough, back into the old section where the lights were dim and the ceiling dripped with stale condensation. They reached the main shaft and climbed out one by one, emerging into the light gasping and streaked with dirt. Henry spun around and aimed his flashlight down the hole, but no one followed. The chase had ended below. For now. They didn't waste time. Kayla drove straight to her contact in the city, handing over the files and digital copies of every image and recording. Jerome, meanwhile, returned to the house and called every local journalist, every independent environmental watchdog he could find. He sent the footage to Kayla's reporter friend, to the national paper that had once exposed a water contamination scandal, even to a state representative whose office had promised transparency during campaign season. By nightfall, the story had begun to spread. The footage went live in a city news outlet, then bounced to social media. The photos of the Kendricks control room, the oil-streaked soil, the workers in uniform, the schematics, all of it was there. Public, irrefutable. That night, Jerome stood at his kitchen window and watched the darkness press against the glass. The wind rustled the grass outside, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. The land was still. The silence had returned, but it was no longer a silence of ignorance. It was the breath before reckoning. Beneath the ground, the voices that had once whispered in hidden tunnels had been dragged into the light. And the men who had stolen from the earth would now have to answer to it. The morning after the story broke was unlike any other Jerome had known in his life. The sun still rose the same way, brushing soft gold across the tops of the fields, and the dew still clung to the blades of grass like it always had. But the silence that once made his land feel sacred now vibrated with unseen movement. He could feel it in the soil under his boots, in the hum of distant engines that didn't belong to any farm, in the uneasy tension behind the ordinary. Everything felt like a held breath. It began quietly, as all great reckonings do. A county patrol car parked at the edge of his property around 8 in the morning. 2 deputies stepped out, their faces unreadable, and walked to the front door with slow, deliberate steps. Jerome greeted them on the porch, his posture straight, heart steady. They didn't question him. They asked if he was willing to accompany them to the sheriff's office and provide a formal statement regarding what he had uncovered. He nodded without hesitation. There was nothing left to hide. Inside the station, a different kind of quiet settled. He sat in a room that smelled of dust and stale coffee, where the hum of fluorescent lights filled every space between words. A young officer transcribed everything: how Jerome had found the sinkhole, the descent into the tunnel, the discoveries made, the evidence collected. Kayla arrived with a printed dossier of the photographs and copies of the sample analysis results. Henry came too, silent and watchful, placing the red plastic scrap from the explosion on the desk like an unspoken accusation. The sheriff was not a man prone to emotion. He listened with narrowed eyes, occasionally leaning back in his chair with arms folded, expression unreadable. But when Kayla laid out the blueprints of the tunnel network and pointed to the corporate logos embedded in the documentation, something changed. He excused himself, took the files into a back office, and did not return for nearly half an hour. When he did, he wasn't alone. 2 plainclothes state investigators followed behind him, one with a notepad, the other with a small black briefcase. They introduced themselves quietly, then asked to see the original evidence. Kayla produced her sealed samples and handed over the digital copies. Jerome could see it in their faces. They already knew this was bigger than their jurisdiction. By evening, the farm was no longer quiet. Unmarked SUVs rolled onto the property first. Then came utility trucks with ground-penetrating radar equipment. Men and women in protective gear walked the fields, marking soil, drilling test cores, comparing notes. Tents went up along the southern field. Floodlights were erected near the sinkhole. Jerome stood by the barn, arms folded, watching as his land was transformed into something between a crime scene and a battlefield. The workers didn't speak to him. They moved with the confidence of people following orders from far above, but he knew better than to assume silence meant ignorance. Word had spread. The images had reached the evening news. Regional outlets had already begun spinning the story. Farmer uncovers illegal oil network beneath historic land. More were calling each hour, asking for statements, interviews, access. Jerome declined them all. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He wanted justice. The first arrests came 2 days later, not in his county, but in a neighboring one, where a Kendrick's subsidiary maintained a satellite office disguised as an agricultural supply chain consultancy. 3 men were taken into custody: a project manager, a site engineer, and a logistics officer. None of them resisted. According to the Newswire, one had even volunteered names of others involved, citing years of guilt. The documents found in the tunnel were authenticated by independent auditors. The oil samples matched recent refinery logs from a Kendrick's partner facility 300 miles south. Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Corporate offices were raided. More names surfaced. Jerome watched all of this unfold from his porch. Reporters still waited outside the gate most days. Sometimes he waved. Most times he ignored them. The land was healing beneath his feet, but he knew better than to believe it would happen quickly. What had been poisoned over decades could not be mended in days. There was remediation to be done. Kayla had coordinated a team to oversee soil restoration, groundwater protection, and tunnel stabilization. Temporary funding came from a federal environmental emergency fund. Eventually, court-ordered restitution would be assigned, but the damage ran deeper than any dollar amount. His southern field would never be the same, but it would live. One afternoon, he walked the edge of that field and paused near the old crater. It had been partially filled now, the edges reinforced with natural barriers to prevent further collapse. He knelt down and touched the earth with his bare hand. It was dry but stable, warm under the sun, and no longer reeking of oil and sulfur. He remembered planting corn here with his father, his hands too small to push the seeds deep enough, his father laughing and guiding his fingers. He remembered his grandfather standing at the far ridge, shouting about rain in the distance. He remembered the feeling that this land had always been his, and now he knew why that feeling had become clouded with confusion. Something had been stolen from his family, from his memory, from his birthright. But he had taken it back. Later that week, a formal ceremony was held at the courthouse. The mayor read a proclamation recognizing Jerome for his courage, vigilance, and service to the public trust. Jerome accepted it quietly, shaking hands with men who only months ago would have dismissed him as a paranoid farmer. He stood behind the podium only once, saying simply that truth had been buried, but the land had remembered. That was all. The compensation came in stages. Some financial, tied to land use and crop loss. Some logistical, including permanent access to water purification systems, upgraded soil management infrastructure, and federal oversight of future drilling permissions within a 10-mile radius. More than once, Kendrick's Energy offered to settle privately with a non-disclosure agreement attached. Jerome refused them all. Kayla continued her work on the environmental side, overseeing replanting initiatives and documenting the long-term recovery. Henry returned to his quiet routines, occasionally helping Jerome with fencing or repairs. But something had changed in them all. They had seen what lay beneath, and they would never forget it. A year passed. The farm bloomed again. Wildflowers returned along the edge of the southern fence. The bees that once vanished found their way back. Crops grew taller, thicker. The soil, enriched with new care and protection, produced yields higher than Jerome had seen in 20 years. But more than that, the weight was gone. The silence of the land was once again peaceful, not haunted. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled orange and lavender, Jerome stood on his porch holding a glass of sweet tea. The fields rustled in the breeze. Somewhere near the barn, a fox darted past the fence line, disappearing into the tall grass. The earth was whole again, and though its memory would never fade, it had forgiven. Not forgotten, but forgiven. He didn't need to look at the framed photographs or the clippings pinned to the wall. He remembered it all, the hole in the earth, the stolen oil, the names, the tunnel, the fire, the silence. And he remembered the moment it all began to shift, not when the ground opened, but when he chose not to look away. The land had whispered for decades. And finally, Someone had listened.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.